Welcome to your Brain On podcast with your hosts, Drs. Ayesha and Dean Sherzai. Today's episode is about the myths and facts of Alzheimer's disease. We're going to pick some of the most prominent myths out there, and we're going to dissect it and present the facts. Dean, are you ready?
I'm very ready. I think it's such an important concept because Alzheimer's being one of the fastest growing epidemics, it's going to challenge our society. And one of the first things society must be prepared for is myths and false information. So I think this is going to be helpful.
I agree with you. I think it's going to be very helpful. And these are some of the most prominent questions that we get from our NeuroWorld community, as well as some of the Ask Me Anythings or AMAs on social media, specifically on IG that we put out.
And just for our audience's sake, because we always try to be transparent and bring it into our own lives, we've both been infected with COVID. And that's a scary little situation because we don't really know what happens to our brains once we are infected with COVID. And there's all these other issues. Although you and I had an easy time going through this process, but it's still an important fact that we need to discuss. Maybe at the end, we'll tell you about the myths and facts that we know of about COVID and its effect on the brain.
That's right. Yeah. So if you hear some stuffiness or some sexy voice coming out, it's probably because of remnants of COVID.
Please speak for yourself. This is my natural sexy voice.
Okay,
yes,
gotcha. All right. No, we're on the mend. Thankfully, it was a mild case.
It was.
We're feeling better. All right. Myth number 1. If you're older, Alzheimer's is inevitable. We hear that all the time, that Alzheimer's is a disease of aging. And essentially, in many communities, Alzheimer's and aging is synonymous. It's one and the same thing.
It is. It's considered synonymous. It's not an aging disease. Alzheimer's is a biological accumulative trauma. And by trauma, I mean the traumas of physiology, the traumas of metabolism, the traumas that we experience in our body and environment for that matter. The main contributors are inflammation, oxidation, glucose dysregulation, and lipid dysregulation. These 4, we call them the 4 horsemen. They are devastating. And it's not just one of those. Often it's a combination of those because they contribute to each other. On top of that, we also know things like hearing loss. We also know things like environmental factors. So it's a cumulative process that ends up in a pathologic process that we call Alzheimer's. Yes, it is ultimately driven by these abnormal proteins, amyloid and tau, but often they're not the starting points. So Alzheimer's is not a lightning strike. Alzheimer's is a slow burn that builds and builds decades earlier. So if we take it in that context, it is actually quite helpful because if we look at it in that context, we can actually affect it early on, influence each of those intervening variables. If you have insulin resistance, if you have trauma to your head, if you have inflammation, you can address it early and affect the disease powerfully. So that's the way we see the disease. And also, it's the way that we can treat the disease.
Yeah, I find that very empowering because if you think of it as a cumulative condition, which basically means that the damage that gets done, you don't really spend time on fixing it, or you actually don't give yourself an opportunity for that damage to rehabilitate. And I think life is like that. If you need sleep and if you don't sleep, you do some damage. But if you do sleep, your brain actually cleanses itself and it repairs itself. So there's always something you can do to allow for the brain to repair itself. I find that empowering. A lot of people might actually find that scary. I hope that our listeners actually find that empowering because that essentially means that if you work towards taking care of your brain and if you give it the right opportunity to heal itself and to thrive, you can prevent Alzheimer's disease.
Absolutely.
Fantastic.
So the next myth is that Alzheimer's has to do with memory loss.
I think that's a very common one. And the reason it's common is because most of the cases of Alzheimer's disease, they begin as memory loss, where people become forgetful, they forget names, they forget where they place things, they forget how to get home or get to a familiar place. So forgetfulness is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, but forgetfulness or memory loss is just one aspect of the disease. Multiple different cognitive functions actually get affected in Alzheimer's disease. As you and I know, our patients may have some memory problems in the beginning, but then later on they tend to have things like difficult difficulty with making a decision, judgment problems. They have spatial issues where they can't really figure out how near or far they are from an object. A lot of patients actually come with a lot of bumps and bruises because they bump into things not really necessarily knowing where they are in a particular location. That's one of the reasons why driving becomes so difficult, because of visual spatial difficulties. Other problems are motor function, movement gets difficult, etc. So in Alzheimer's disease, while memory problems are prominent, it can be accompanied with multiple different issues as well. And I think that's one of the differentiators of Alzheimer's disease from other types of dementias. And other types of dementias, like for example, in frontotemporal lobe dementia, one of the salient features, initial salient feature, is difficulty with judgment and decision making. So frontal lobe problem. But in Alzheimer's disease, it tends to be memory, but it's not just memory.
It isn't. And when it comes to memory, what's really unique is disproportionate short-term memory in comparison to long-term memory.
That's right.
In fact, many of our patients come to us, or they're brought to us by their family member, and they say, no, I have no problem. I can remember 50 years back. That's the whole issue. Long-term memory is retained, is sustained. In fact, to them, it actually appears like long-term memory is better. But in reality, what's happening is they're forgetting their breakfast, or they're forgetting what was happening yesterday, yet long-term memory is retained, so it's highlighted. So that this proportionality of short-term memory loss versus retention of long-term memory loss is a common feature of Alzheimer's.
I think that's a very good point, and I think that's one of the main reasons why people don't seek help initially, and especially when families report that an elder has memory loss, it usually gets covered up by the fact that they tell stories, they're very well read. Say, for example, a lot of them can be history buffs and they can remember in very vivid detail stories from the past. But then when you ask them, like, oh, where were we this morning? Or what did you eat? Or what happened yesterday? They have difficulty.
Exactly.
And because of their eloquence, they just like belittle those small little quips or forgetfulness. And this stays for months and years, and families think, oh no, they're fine. They can remember everything. But the reason I'm highlighting that is because if we see a loved one going through something similar where they're very smart and they're educated and they know a lot of information and they basically dwell in that, but they have difficulty with short-term memory, they need to be seen by a neurologist as soon as possible.
Absolutely. And that distinction is important because if we are aware of it, you can bring the patient early enough where you can do something about it. And often we get the patient very late. And that matters.
Yeah, early detection matters a lot. Okay, the third myth is it's all genetics. There's nothing one can do. I think that's probably one of the most common things when loved ones go through dementia. Their families say, because they had it, I definitely have it, and there's really nothing that anybody can do. And they essentially just prepare to start having Alzheimer's disease at some point in their life.
Alzheimer's has gene involvement like everything else has gene involvement. Even your behaviors have genetic involvement. We know so much about the influence of genes in everything we do, from behavior to disease to even our body's responses to environmental factors and things of that nature. So we know that genetics is involved. And in Alzheimer's, we have identified more than 100 genes that have some measure of influence on the risk of developing Alzheimer's. Now, these genes have different measures and different amounts of influence. Some of the genes are very strongly associated with Alzheimer's. They say that they have high penetrance. High penetrance means that this gene has a significant influence on outcome. So, for example, presenilin-1, PSEN2, and APP have 100% penetrance, meaning that if you have these genes, it's almost 100% certain that you will develop the disease before the age of 65. And those genes constitute less than 5% of all Alzheimer's. Now, what about other genes? We have many other genes. We talked about over 100. So we have ApoE4, which is a very common one that everybody knows about. It's the ApoE4, which is in the family of ApoE genes, ApoE2, ApoE3, and ApoE4. They are a lipid metabolism protein. The gene creates the protein that is involved in transport of lipids and other functions as well. Now, if you have one gene, ApoE4, one allele for one parent, your risk goes up 4 times. If you have 2, one from each parent, your risk goes up as much as 12 times. But we know that people who have 2 genes, they don't necessarily develop the disease. It's not a guarantee. And there's a tremendous influence of lifestyle on the outcome. And in this case, your cholesterol level, your LDL level, things of that nature, and even inflammatory factors. So even though it has a very strong risk, it's still strongly and powerfully affected by lifestyle. What about other genes? We have many other genes. We have the CLU1, we have the SOM, CLU1, we have the SOM, TREM2, we have ABCA7, many others. And all of them have to do with some measure of our body's response to either glucose or lipid or inflammation or even getting rid of waste. So as you can see, there are genes that are functioning as a response to body's inflammation, glucose regulation, and things of that nature. So the genetic interplay there is what's called epigenetic phenomenon, meaning the interplay between genes and environmental and lifestyle factors, between genes and inflammation, between genes and oxidation, and so on. So this again is quite optimistic and hopeful because the genetic component of it, for the most part, is driven by environmental factors and their interplay with genes. And we know that we can influence that.
Yeah. And for the audience who are listening right now, some of them may wonder, okay, I really want to get tested for these genes. What do I do? As far as the early onset risk genes like presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and amyloid precursor proteins are concerned, those are usually ordered if there is a serious consideration for early onset dementia, which you said that constitutes less than 5% of the total cases in the world. So, your doctor may order those and it has to go to a special lab and get it done. Those are not available commercially. The one that is available commercially right now is the ApoE4 gene. This one is essentially a late onset risk gene and they can be tested. There was a time when you and I were kind of like, why are you getting it? You're going to be stressed out. But now we know that if you want to get tested and if you want to know whether you are positive for ApoE4 gene, there might be certain things that you might do. Like, for example, now we have more information about the importance of your omega-3 fatty acid levels. It's really important for you to know how to modify your dietary preferences with ApoE4 to a certain extent. It's not strong. It is being replicated, but there is some trend towards understanding the importance of adding polyunsaturated fatty acids, things of that nature. So people can actually get it tested now.
Absolutely. It's critical that we understand what we can and what we can't do.
Yeah.
None of these are covered by insurance.
No.
And so you have to know that if you want to do ApoE4, it has to be out of pocket. And it's not that expensive, but it is still out of pocket. At this point, your doctor will not order it ad hoc. The other myth is if there's no cure, there's no need to diagnose it.
Oh, goodness. I think it's really important to diagnose it because the way our brain function works is we all tend to have some cognitive decline starting in our 20s. I know this sounds a little strange. Right around age 20 is when you start experiencing some cognitive decline.
As it stands now, you and I always say that if we live a certain kind of life, if we live a healthy life, that's not necessarily the case.
So maybe we should just say the typical Western style lifestyle.
Correct.
So, you start having some decline, and that could potentially be because of an unhealthy pattern, like you said, lack of sleep, not exercising, eating terrible food, alcohol, drugs, smoking, stress, mental health issues, not addressing those, etc., etc.
Sudoku.
Sudoku causes trouble for you only.
I know.
There's millions of people who love Sudoku, okay?
I'll take that back.
Sudoku company, please don't sue us. So there are multiple different factors. And then during our midlife, we take multiple hits during our midlife. Blood pressure arises, and a lot of people in the United States, unfortunately, obesity, metabolic disorders like diabetes, high cholesterol, LDL shooting up, unhealthy lifestyles added to that, lack of eating well and exercise, and women going through perimenopause. During midlife, after your 12 years of education of high school and maybe potentially some college, people are not in the culture of keeping their minds active. We kind of like go into almost this automated lifestyle where we just work and sleep and work and sleep, but we really don't do anything to improve our cognition, whether it's your vocabulary, your thinking process, your language, whatever it may be, right? We really don't do any of that.
No, people narrow, and that narrowing has significant consequences, especially at the time that you need to expand cognitive function.
Yes. And so that is usually the stage where people start experiencing mild cognitive impairment, MCI. People usually think that MCI happens later in life, but no, MCI can actually happen as early as 30s and 40s, but it just lingers. People just think that's normal. We're not fear-mongering. We're basically just talking about the enormous number of people who live with cognitive decline and never get diagnosed, or they never really find out that this is going on. So coming back to the importance of diagnosis, when you diagnose something, when you're at the MCI stage, that is a huge opportunity for you to do something about it, because we know that the majority of MCI cases can be reversed and they can actually get better. But once you actually enter the phase of a specific stage of Alzheimer's disease, whether it's mild, moderate, or advanced, that's when reversal is impossible, almost impossible for the majority of cases.
But even in those cases, although you can't reverse it,
you can slow down the progress.
You can slow down the process.
Yes.
And more importantly, knowing what kind of disease somebody has, if it's frontotemporal versus Alzheimer's versus Lewy body disease versus vascular, you can do so much to address it as far as their symptoms are concerned, as far as the anxieties that happen in different ways in different disease processes, as far as quality of life is concerned. That is a major part of what we do with our patients, is take them through that journey. Although we don't promise false hope of reversing Alzheimer's, which many charlatans do, the bigger responsibility is helping them go through this journey in a very honorable and a dignified, anxiety-free, and a beautiful way forward. As important as prevention of Alzheimer's is helping people who have Alzheimer's have a beautiful life in their journey forward.
Very true.
And you and I have done this. I think we treat the anxiety, fear, sleeplessness, the psychosis that comes with the stages of Alzheimer's more aggressively than with medicines like donepezil and others that are supposed to affect memory. But addressing their anxiety, their fears, their hallucinations actually gives them quality of life at a very traumatic and vulnerable time in their life.
Very true. You and I keep on talking about prevention, which is very important, but we have the privilege of seeing patients in clinic and treating Alzheimer's patients, and some of these medications just do wonders. I am so happy that we have modalities, whether it's medication, therapy, or both, or caregiver support group, like the ones that we actually have these conversations in Neuro World. These are important and they make a huge difference. All right, the next myth is women get Alzheimer's more just because they live longer.
That's definitely a myth. 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are women. 1 in 6 women developing Alzheimer's in their lifetime and 1 in 11 men. It's almost twice. And it appears to be multifactorial. It has to do with our treatment and our response in the healthcare system to menopause and perimenopause situations. It has to do with stress levels. It has to do with the cohort of the population that's coming to us from 80 years ago, which had lower education. Education is a big protective factor, not schooling in itself, but the level of cognitive activity early in life, as well as other factors that we might not know yet. And that's what needs to be studied. We haven't studied this condition in women well, and it must be done because 2/3 of the caregivers are women and 2/3 of those that are suffering from Alzheimer's are women. So we must study it more. But the short of it is it's multifactorial. It's not just the fact that they live longer. And we are learning more and more about it, especially the perimenopausal factor, which appears to have more to do with when you start treatment as opposed to whether you start treatment. And the latest data shows what kind of treatment. Is it estrogen alone, which seems to be protective at a particular time, versus estrogen and progesterone, which actually seems to increase the risk at a particular time. We have an entire podcast on this with incredible people for those that want to hear it.
Yes, Your Brain on Menopause.
Your Brain on Menopause.
That was a very rich conversation. So if our audience wants to learn more about that, please go listen to that episode.
So the next myth is mental stimulation alone can prevent Alzheimer's.
Mental stimulation is very important, and I think it's one of those things that really hasn't been addressed much. However, you do need a very comprehensive plan for protecting your brain against Alzheimer's disease. Mental activity is just one of them. There are so many different factors that have been studied extensively, namely nutrition, exercise, addressing vascular risk factors like blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes, sleep and sleep disorders being addressed, stress, mental health issues being addressed. All of these play a very important role. And I think it differs from person to person. For example, if someone has had the opportunity to develop mental resilience and cognitive reserve early in life. So say, for example, if they went to school for a long period of time. And, going to school is just a proxy for mental activity. You can actually be very mentally active without going to school. Say, for example, if someone has had resilience built for a long period of time, but then they just ate hot dogs and hamburgers and they just sat around and they didn't do anything, that mental activity is not going to do anything.
Correct, because the vascular damage from the poor diet is going to actually destroy the resilience that you're building with cognitive activity alone.
Absolutely. Or say, for example, if someone is a bodybuilder and they're like big and they have all the muscles, but all they eat is meat and butter, which we see on Instagram quite a lot nowadays.
Or livers, for that matter.
Oh, goodness.
Or testicles. For some reason, they're into testicles and livers. I have no idea why.
I don't know where that came from.
We know why. It's just very superficial knowledge of anatomy.
Honestly, it's difficult sometimes, especially when there's almost this feeling that this is it. Like, I have done my research and I know everything and this is how it is. When you're an influencer, you have responsibility for other people as well. In any case, I digress. My point is, it takes multiple different modalities to protect the brain, and cognitive stimulation is not just one of them, or exercise is not just one of them, or even nutrition is not just one of them. All right. The next one is coconut oil and MCT oil protects your brain. I've heard that a lot.
The answer is no. The entirety of work on coconut oil came from a case study, one case study. And one case study does not make a public health movement. There's no evidence of coconut oil having benefit. In fact, people who eat a lot of coconut oil, which has saturated fat, can, by extension, have elevated LDL, which by extension can have then increased risk. Many robust papers and meta-analyses have demonstrated the relationship between high LDL and cognitive decline and dementias and Alzheimer's. But with MCT, there's some signal in some smaller papers short-term, but there's nothing long-term that shows any evidence. And here's what the surprising factor is. In social media, you see so much about MCT that you would actually think that there must be a world of data on MCT.
Yeah.
There isn't. The data is weak. We're still waiting to see if there's any meaningful signal. But at this point, there isn't. What worries me is that people who take MCT, either in its pure form or as a food product with other oils, that they might actually increase their LDL and by extension their risk. So that's where we are with coconut oil and MCT.
Yeah.
So the next myth is that lion's mane mushroom reverses Alzheimer's and memory loss.
Yes, we have actually talked about this. I made a couple of Instagram reels on that, and the bottom line is there's no convincing evidence that lion's mane mushroom is neurogenerative or it protects against Alzheimer's disease at all. I think this notion and this information came from some curiosity over lion's mane and mushrooms in general, but specifically lion's mane. But they're usually done in petri dishes and cells. So they're just mechanistic studies. And then they've done some animal studies on them. And the human study, I'm actually reading it here. I pulled it up. It was done a while ago. It was a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical trial, but only 30 people. They looked at 30 people and they were in Japan and they had mild cognitive impairment and they were between the ages of 50 to 80. They were given lion's mane mushroom 3 times a day for 16 weeks. And at the end of the study, they showed some improvement in their cognitive scores compared to the controls. But when the intervention ended, their score decreased within 4 weeks. Now, there was so many other confounding factors in that study. The communication with the dietitian, the involvement in that community group, all of these other things. And the kind of cognitive testing that they were using, they really haven't been replicated. They haven't really been seen in other cohorts as well. So all in all, that was a very small study of 30 people for a short period of time, 16 weeks. And the improvement was, it didn't really make a huge difference. And it hasn't really been studied since then. So I would say no, don't waste your money. Lion's mane mushroom is expensive. And I think this applies to so many other nootropics and foods or supplements as well, where there's a tiny little study that is done, maybe in humans, but mostly in animals, or mechanistic studies. And then that's just exaggerated into something earth-shatteringly good for brain health. It's not.
One of the latest was saffron, and there was a major study done, and the signal was nominal, and the source was questionable, But one of the internet doctors made such a huge deal out of it. It was as if it was a cure for Alzheimer's.
Because he's selling his supplements. He basically talked about how saffron is good for mood and brain health. And I think he was talking more about mental health. But then he has his own line of saffron supplementation. Just the fact that most of these studies come from basically one region in the world and from a small group of scientists that continue to read that over and over again. That's a problem. Unless it's replicated in other populations and that change is meaningful, it doesn't mean anything
That's
so far.
exactly right. We want that aspect of science to spread throughout the population. How to look at data, how to evaluate data, how to give value to the weight of the data they're seeing.
All right, let's do this one. Creatine boosts brain power and it prevents decline.
You did a post on this. Creatine is interesting. Although we were incredulous about its effect on cognition because the data is not there yet.
I'm still incredulous.
No, we are incredulous, yeah.
Yes.
About its effect on brain, especially some people that have exaggerated it again. The data is weak,
Yes.
and we're still waiting for further data. And why is that important, especially in light of the fact that it's good for muscle growth?
So much data to
So much
show
data.
that it's safe and it's good for
So
muscle
why
growth.
are the shares eyes fighting this thing that it's good for muscle? It doesn't have much side effects, although if you take too much of it, it can have a negative effect on your kidneys.
In some people.
In some people. Then why are they talking so negatively about its effect on brain? Because we have to be clear, because that's how people misappropriate. That's how people take advantage of others with false data. So it might be good for muscle, but other people may buy it at a great cost to themselves for brain health, and it might not be effective for brain health. So yes, if you're in the age or in the health situation where you're building muscle, absolutely. And by the way, we take some creatine while building
do.
muscle. Yeah. But for brain, if there are people out there who have memory issues and cognitive issues and they want to take it for brain, there is no evidence. And it might turn out to be negative. So at this point, I think you have to make that distinction. Otherwise, people will take advantage of it.
Beautifully stated.
So the next myth is Prevagen is a great memory boosting drug.
Oh, goodness. This may come as a surprise to many people, but we actually don't have any validated data suggesting that Prevagen is good for brain health or it helps prevent dementia or Alzheimer's disease. And yet it is one of the most popular supplements that people continue to buy, including my family members. They all run to Prevagen because they've seen some infomercials. That's the power of marketing, isn't it? Because even when you go to the Prevagen's website and the clinical trial that they quote from a while ago, it basically didn't show any cognitive benefits. And yet they keep on saying, yeah, it does benefit your brain, and people just buy it.
Some of those really warm commercials, the people that actually say that their life was changed, that's a strong sell. To be honest, when I look at those videos, I'm like, oh my goodness, they're such beautiful
warm,
people,
fuzzy music in
exactly.
the background.
But so it's powerful. Marketing works.
Warm faces. Remember that gentleman he's such a good-looking
that's the way they
elderly
do it.
gentleman, sweet, and he's working.
That's why I'm here in this podcast.
Prevagen's claims have been legally challenged now, and its main ingredients, aquaporin, which is derived from jellyfish, there's actually no validated mechanism for improving human cognition. It definitely hasn't done much for the poor jellyfish.
No.
That's for sure. All right. The next myth is dementia and Alzheimer's are interchangeable.
They're not. One is a subcategory of the other. Dementia is an umbrella disease. It's like cancer, and it's a combination of symptoms. What is it? It's when people have difficulty with daily activities, when they have difficulty with driving or finances or making phone calls or cooking, things of that nature, any of those or all of those for that matter. When people have those kind of difficulties, they are considered to have dementia, especially if it's sustained. Now, there are types of dementia. The most common type is Alzheimer's. It's about 60 to 70% of all dementias is Alzheimer's. Then you have also vascular dementia. You have Lewy body dementia, which is the visuospatial component, as well as movement disorder. You have Parkinson's and dementia. You have frontotemporal lobe dementia. You have Huntington's dementia. And the list goes on and on. But the main type, the biggest category, is Alzheimer's dementia. And they are distinctly different, both clinically as well as pathologically. The disease ultimately at the end point is driven by amyloid and tau in Alzheimer's, and other diseases, it's other proteins, other abnormal proteins that accumulate. We just have to know the distinction between the different ones. And it matters to know which type because they have different treatments, different preventions, different ways to actually deal with the patient in their disease course.
Absolutely.
So the next myth is there's absolutely nothing you can do once the symptoms start.
That's not true at all. We have tremendous amount of data showing that when the symptoms of memory loss begin in Alzheimer's disease, whether it's in the MCI stage or in the early phases of Alzheimer's disease, you can definitely slow down the progression. But in the MCI stages, we have evidence that you can even reverse MCI. Whether it's with exercise, the twin study showed that with resistance training, you could reverse the symptoms of MCI. With diet, we have studies from Rush University that looked at adherence to the MIND diet can actually slow down cognitive decline significantly. And then recently we have studies that show that addressing vascular risk factors can actually reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease by 40%. And the study from Rush University showed that in a dose response manner, you can reduce the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 60% by addressing all of these factors that we talked about.
And we believe, and this is where the extrapolation is, and we have to make sure that people understand this extrapolation. We don't have evidence yet, but because we know the mechanisms, inflammation, oxidation, glucose dysregulation, even the genetic factors, majority of genetic factors have to do with these processes, that if people live an optimal life, and that's a difficult thing to do, and start this process early enough, about 80 to 90% are potentially reversible. And that's important to know because at this point, we don't have populations or individuals that have done just that or large enough population where we could study this. But there's enough evidence from physiology and the directions that we see from other studies that if you live optimally early enough, for 80 to 90% of those at risk, you can prevent the disease.
Amazing. All right. The next myth is you can't diagnose Alzheimer's until death.
Well, no, that's what was believed before, that once a person died, you took the brain, you did autopsy, you found the particular patterns of amyloid accumulation, especially certain parts of the brain, amyloid and tau. But now we know that there is a very strong relationship between amyloid and tau in the cerebrospinal fluid, even now with blood tests. We also now have tools like PET scans, positive emission tomography, which looks at the specific molecules, tau and amyloid in the brain, and will tell you the likelihood of having Alzheimer's and at what stage. MRI can even give you some evidence by the pattern of atrophy, if it's the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe atrophying disproportionate to the rest of the brain. That's a very strong indicator. So all these tools are pretty powerful in indicating the likelihood of disease and the stage. The incredible new discoveries are these tests that tell the likelihood of Alzheimer's as accurately as cerebrospinal fluid or imaging through blood. This is so exciting that we brought it in our clinic and Brain Health Institute, and everybody's talking about this because very early on you can tell the risk from just a blood test.
Yeah. And just to describe these tests, so the test is LumiPulse, and it looks at p-tau 217 over A-beta 42 ratio. And it shows 91.7% positive predictive value and 97.3% negative predictive value for amyloid presence, which basically means that the chances of detection is incredibly high and the chance of missing it or reading it as a false result is very low, which means it's a really good test. And then there's another one called Precivity AD2 test. Again, it looks at p-tau and A-beta ratios, and that's about 88 to 92% accuracy. Quest has AD Detect. That's the name of the test, and it offers over 90% sensitivity and specificity. So these are the ones that have been approved within the past few months in 2025, and it gives us a lot of hope for people to be able to figure out whether they are at risk or not. It's only available for people who are over the age of 55. I believe not everybody can do it. Only people who have some symptoms or at least concern for Alzheimer's disease can get it done.
Absolutely. And that's exciting because early detection, that means that most people will do it, will give us a path to early intervention and treatment.
Yes, absolutely.
So the next myth is that certain medications like statins can cause Alzheimer's.
Yes, this myth has been floating around for years. And the most hate that I have received on social media and YouTube was for a reel that I did on statins, where people just started attacking and they called us, pharmaceutical shills. I understand the fear and the discomfort that people have with medication, especially with statins. The truth is there's absolutely no convincing evidence that statin increased the risk of Alzheimer's disease. On the contrary, we have very strong evidence that when people take statins to lower their LDL, especially for people who have familial hypercholesterolemia, where whatever they do and they can't lower their LDL cholesterol, if they take statins, they actually lower their risk of Alzheimer's disease. So in 2025, a systematic review and a meta-analysis was published, and it looked at 55 observational studies, and it covered 7 million people. So it's not a tiny study. Okay, 7 million people for a long period of time, 55 observational studies, and they found that statin use was associated with, drumroll, 14% lower risk of all-cause dementia, hazard ratio was 0.86, 18% lower risk of Alzheimer's disease, hazard ratio of 0.82, and rosuvastatin specifically saw up to 28% lower risk, hazard ratio of 0.72. That's remarkable. And then there was another study, another 2025 meta-analysis, and that one looked at 42 cohort studies and 6.3 million participants, and they reported 21% reduction in dementia risk. All-cause dementia risk. And then there was another Korean study that was published in April of this year, and they showed that people with LDL levels of less than 70 milligrams per deciliter had 26% lower dementia risk and 28% lower Alzheimer's risk, plus a further 13% added reduction in statin users regardless of LDL level.
Wow.
So I think it probably has to do with its pleiotropic effect, the anti-inflammatory effects
Correct.
that statins have.
Correct.
And even as a stroke specialist, I remember when I was a fellow at Columbia University, the fellows were recruited as research assistants, and we were involved in the Sparkle trial. And for those who don't know, Sparkle trial was aggressive lowering of LDL right after a stroke. There was a placebo arm, and then there was a medication arm. We all knew who was on the medication arm because LDL plummeted. It showed that people who lowered their LDL drastically during that period, they had significantly smaller stroke size, better outcomes, better stroke outcomes, and reduced risk of having secondary strokes. So they actually stopped the trial because they found it unethical to continue because of this massive success in finding the number. So there's a lot of data showing that whether it's for vascular, brain health, or neurodegenerative conditions, that statin actually are protective. Now, a lot of people question it and they don't want to do anything with it because there's a lot of misinformation out there saying that, oh, your brain is made out of fat and statins damage your brain because it reduces fat or it modifies fat or it impacts its metabolism. Absolutely not. The data is so strongly in favor of statins, especially for people who have high LDL. For the audience who's listening,
How much was your check from a pharma?
I wish I got something.
Somebody's going to say that somewhere. Yeah.
We would have better cameras.
Absolutely. Yeah, these cheap little cameras.
These cheap little cameras.
Yeah.
They're doing their job. They're getting the message across. So that's all I care about.
Correct.
Okay. The next one is, this one is controversial. Are you ready?
Yes.
Vaccines like flu shots increase the risk of Alzheimer's.
The answer is no.
Okay. Did you get close to the mic just for like dramatic effect?
No.
Yeah.
The answer is no. There's absolutely no evidence of that. In fact, there is some evidence that people who take vaccination, specifically for flu, they might have lower risk. That data still needs to be better elucidated. More work has to be done. We have to be transparent and clear. But at least the risk being higher is not true.
Yeah. And you recently did a fantastic reel about Shingrix or shingles vaccine and lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. There's been several papers now that say that when people get vaccinated for shingles, they actually have lower risk of Alzheimer's disease. And they've adjusted for things like healthcare access, for all the other confounding factors that could be interplayed here.
Yeah, but still, I think we still need more work on that, more evidence to show the positive relationship. But at least the negative relationship does not exist. So we'll put that one to rest.
Amazing. All right. The next myth is Alzheimer's is a type of diabetes, type 3 diabetes. And I think it stems from the fact that people say that sugar or glucose metabolism issues are the origin of Alzheimer's.
Yeah, the problem is that Alzheimer's is not one type of disease. It has many different courses towards the same outcome. People can come to Alzheimer's from, we talked about amyloid, those 5% where amyloid is the driver. It's the presenilin 1, presenilin 2, and APP. For others, diabetes or uncontrolled diabetes is the path, or uncontrolled even prediabetes. So we talk about prediabetes that should be identified, that should be treated early, or at least by lifestyle, through lifestyle. Others come to Alzheimer's through dyslipidemia, elevated LDL, and the vascular disease that happens consequently. And others through inflammation, head trauma. People who have traumatic brain injury have chronic inflammation that push them towards Alzheimer's. So there are different paths. So what has happened is somebody looked at the data on diabetes and Alzheimer's, and they made that connection. Yes, diabetes has twice the risk. Those who have elevated sugar levels, specifically diabetes that is uncontrolled, have twice to 3 times the risk of developing Alzheimer's. But that's not the only path. There are other directions as well. And if we know that, then we will be more careful and not just focus on one element of it.
Yeah, we did a post a long time ago, and we basically, it was a joke. We said, calling Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes is like attributing a car accident to rain. Correct. There's so many other things that can happen for the car to have an accident. Rain might be just one of the elements that contributed to it.
One of the reasons, one of the causes. Absolutely. That's a good analogy.
Yeah. All right.
So the next myth is supplements and vitamins can cure or prevent Alzheimer's.
No, sorry. And I know that, a lot of people actually rely on supplements for their brain health, but we don't actually know of any supplement that can cure Alzheimer's disease, despite all the marketing that you hear. And as far as prevention is concerned, I would say no. Replacing some of the micronutrients that you may not be getting in your food is important. Vitamin B12, we know that when vitamin B12 is low, people tend to have cognitive decline and symptoms of dementia. And when that's replaced, they actually do better.
And I want to say that a large percentage of population have B12 deficiency, not just vegans, but as much as 40% or more in Western countries. And as you get older, absorption of vitamin B12 becomes more difficult. So people should be aware. So that's something to be definitely aware of.
Definitely, yeah. So just because you're eating meat doesn't mean that you're okay with your vitamin B12. Please make sure that you check it once in a while. Even checking it once a year is more than enough.
Absolutely.
And it's covered by insurance, and your doctor shouldn't have any issue ordering it because it's relatively inexpensive. The next one that we know of that is currently being studied is the importance of including omega-3 fatty acids in your diet, whether it's through food, whether it's eating flax seeds, chia seeds, hemp seeds, or any other marine sources, including algae. That's great. We actually have an episode, Your Brain on Omega-3. So if you want to do a deep dive into it, please listen to that. But that is important. Does it prevent Alzheimer's disease? We don't know convincingly as of yet. We know there is a signal. So just be aware that we're learning more about it and make sure you're not deficient. And then the third one that recently there was a paper supporting that concept is vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiency can contribute to cognitive decline and symptoms of dementia, and people need to be aware of it and check it. Beyond that, whether it's vitamin C, vitamin E, vitamin A, or all the other vitamins, you can get it best from foods by eating greens, beans, nuts, seeds, whole grains, just a healthy, whole food, plant-predominant dietary pattern, and you're okay. You really don't need to take pills and pills.
And there's some rare cases like thiamine deficiency in alcoholics or some unusual nutritional deficiencies. But beyond that, those are rare. So let's focus on these three because the vitamin market has become replete with charlatans selling people a combination of vitamins depending on the lab values that they find. And that has become so destructive to our patients. How often do we see patients come with bags full of vitamins that were prescribed to them by some private doctor that's trying to sell vitamins, basically?
All right, so that ends the list of all the myths that we had collected from our community and from our online social media AMAs. And I would like to end the episode by asking you, what would be 3 things that you would recommend for our listeners right now to prevent Alzheimer's disease?
I would say 1, exercise. Start a morning walk. I think exercise, especially leg strengthening exercises, especially brisk walks, even stairs, are so critical, so important. We know that it actually grows the brain. So 1, do exercise and add leg strength to that. The second is add green leafy vegetables. It's critical because we know that adding just 1 serving of green leafy vegetables to your diet improves your brain health by 11 years. So add 2 salads. Just simple thing like salads is better than all the vitamin concoctions you've heard in social media. Add 2 servings of green leafy vegetables in your diet and you will significantly improve your brain health. And thirdly, challenge your brain continuously. Learn throughout your life. Even after you retire, we say, don't retire, rewire. Start learning 3, 4 other activities that are divergent, different. Taking classes, learning a musical instrument, learning to dance. Different activities that challenge different aspects of the brain, but in complex, real-life ways. Those actually improve quality of life. A walk a day in the morning is great. Eating green leafy vegetables is great. And challenging your brain with things you love is going to give value to life, but also grow your brain. And those are the 3 things I always start my patients with. And they've been effective because they're easy. People start them, they see an effect, and they can build on those.
You took all the good ones.
No, there's some other good ones. You know.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
I think one of the most important things that we need to keep an eye on as we grow older is our LDL cholesterol. I think everyone over the age of 30 should get their LDL checked. And I think everybody should try to keep their LDL below 70 milligrams per deciliter. That is a quick, easy public health message that I'm throwing out there for better brain health. So please go ahead and check your LDL. The second thing would be build a community, build a circle of friends and core people that you will stay connected for the rest of your life, because these are the people that are going to challenge you, they're going to teach you, they're going to be your inner circle, and that does multiple different things, right? That makes sure that you stay engaged, that you are not lonely, that you have an avenue where you can have conversations about. But please make sure that you choose people with healthy habits, because sometimes we get stuck with unhealthy people around us, and just because of peer pressure, we do the unhealthy things that they're doing. But just like a group of core people that are your friends for the rest of your life, and they will keep your brain young and happy. The third thing would be don't retire. Don't retire. We take retirement seriously in the United States. There's parties and people can't wait to retire. But I think it's really important for people to know that sometimes even the jobs that you do not like keep you at a cognitive state that you're always challenged and you're always dealing with complexity. So even if you hate your job, bring the same challenge and complexity into something else. And stay engaged.
No, but that's
keep your
important.
mind active. Don't retire, rewire. I know that's not my saying, but I love it.
It's beautiful. So what's the one food that you would recommend as a starting point for brain health?
Fiber. It's not a food per se, but it is something that is in foods. And everybody talks about protein. Everybody talks about supplements and vitamins, but nobody talks about fiber. And I think fiber is so sexy, because when you eat fiber, you are not only taking care of your gut health, but through that, you actually take care of your microbiome that controls all the other systems. You stay lean, you stay healthy, and you actually consume a lot of foods that come with fiber that are healthy. So whether it's green leafy vegetables or whole grains or berries or apples and fruits and vegetables and nuts and seeds, they're all amazing foods that keep your brain healthy. Let me ask you, what one food would you recommend other than leafy green vegetables?
Burritos.
No. I love burritos.
No, I think the food, as far as health is concerned, I think I love beans, because just the texture, the substance, it has fiber, it has protein, it has everything you need is in beans. It's probably the most healthy food pound for pound, except for greens. You took greens, so I'll go
you
with
did.
Yeah. So that's good. Beans are amazing. The other food that I love is
we're
mushrooms.
doing more than one. Okay. Tell us about your love for mushrooms.
Yeah, mushrooms and I go a long ways. That sounds weird, because if somebody's into those weird mushrooms, they think that I'm
just regular mushrooms.
Regular
the
mushrooms.
boring mushrooms.
Yeah. So those are 2 amazing foods. I love them.
I love them too. That's wonderful.
Okay, one more. What's one brain activity that you think that you would want to retire with?
Ooh.
Actually, you can have a couple, but let's say 2 things that you want to retire with that challenges your brain and keeps your brain growing.
That's easy. I want to learn the piano very well, and I want to be able to sing. I love singing. I haven't really done a lot of music lately, but I want to have that. It's a gift for myself, and I absolutely enjoy it. And I think music brings all of us together.
Love it.
So those are the 2 things. Maybe it's cheating. Music should be it, right? Music. Yeah. Should I add one other one?
Why not?
Can it be a physical activity?
Yeah,
or does
anything.
It have to?
Absolutely.
Yeah, cycling.
Okay, fantastic.
I love cycling. One activity that you want to retire with?
Okay, ballet. I'm just kidding.
I would love to see you in a tutu.
Yeah, and barely can dance. No, I would say I want to learn the guitar, as you know. I want to be better and better at chess.
Yeah.
I said one, but I'm going to give a couple. And I want to take classes in history and philosophy and others. So online classes or even in-person classes.
Yeah.
I would love to continue doing that, taking different subjects and esoteric topics, fun esoteric topics. And I would love to continue doing that when I retire.
Oh, I would love to take classes too.
Yeah.
You're right.
Yeah.
You're right. I would love to take art classes.
Yes, absolutely.
That's
I've actually
something
started
that we've
taking
never done.
art history.
You have?
Yes,
Where?
online. It's TEDx or edX.
It's fascinating that all of these classes are now available for free for the public from different universities. MIT, Stanford has it. Wonderful. All right. This brings us to the end of the podcast. This was such a fun conversation. Hopefully we'll have more of this, and I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you like this podcast, we would so appreciate it if you take a few moments to give us a review on Apple Podcast. Unfortunately or fortunately, that's the only way that people actually find out about the podcast, and you're going to help us spread this information without any commercial or any infomercial involved into it to as many people as possible to take care of their brain health. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode.